Hello again and welcome to our fifth Students Against Pseudoscience talk. So today, very happy to have Caleb with us. He's an award-winning educator, researcher, and best-selling author. He's also a specialist in cognitive behavioural therapy, anxiety, trauma, and obsessive-compulsive disorders, as well as critical thinking and science skepticism. I'm terribly excited to see what insight Caleb is going to give us about what skepticism is ultimately about and what people get right and wrong about it. So without further ado, we're just going to pass it on to Caleb. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that introduction, and thanks, Barty, for kind of hosting, and everyone that's joined. I appreciate you being here. Hopefully, you'll get something useful out of it, or at the very least, you can say, "I never want to, hear that guy talk again." So either way, you'll be able, to know more than you did when you started. So, what I'm here to talk about today is what I call the true value of skepticism. So share my slides there for you to see. So like, Chris had said, I'm a clinical psychologist and a professor, and have been engaging pretty heavily with the skeptical community here in the States and abroad for about 15 years now. So I've, done extensive blogging and presenting at various skeptical conferences, and I have a best-selling book on critical thinking and skepticism, and have interacted with, I don't even know how many thousands of people who describe themselves as skeptics out there. So one of the things I think we have to do first is come up with kind of some definitions, right? So when I say the word skeptic, or you hear the term skeptical, we all have something come into mind, right? And chances are, though, that we're not all really just thinking of the exact same thing. So when you hear skeptic or skeptical, what comes to your mind? What do you picture? What sort of ideas do you have in mind? Maybe you're seeing somebody who's, kind of giving you what we call the side eye here, right? So like all these various critters, you would look at them and you'd think, well, that seems like a fairly skeptical look. Like, I'm not sure that I quite believe you. So since we probably don't all have the exact same idea of what skeptic means, I wanted to take a moment to just really operationally define it. And so when I say skeptic, what I mean is actually a scientific skeptic. And a scientific skeptic is someone who demands evidence for claims. So when someone says to me, hey, did you know this is true, or that that's true? Or, hey, I heard that this is going on, or I think I saw this thing. We don't just go, oh, I believe you. Like, I believe you regardless of the level of evidence of your claims. No, it's like, okay, well, I could believe you, but I'm going to need you to back up your claim with some, high quality evidence. And there's lots of different ways that evidence can come about, of course, but it's not usually just personal testimonial or, unwavering belief just because someone told me something. So in other words, what I do as a scientific skeptic is I take evidence that's presented to me, and then I use various kinds of scientific methodology and critical thinking skills really to examine that evidence. So if I'm coming into one of my classes, for example, and someone comes in late and they say, hey, I'm sorry, I'm late, but I was driving in here and I ran over and killed a chupacabra on the way in. I'm not just going to be like, wow, that's incredible. I'm glad you still made it in. I'm going to be like, wow, that's an incredible claim. Let's use the evidence that we have that you're going to provide to me. Let's not just believe it offhand. Let's actually examine it. So, what's the evidence that you hit a chupacabra, right? As opposed to just, telling me some crazy story. And so we demand evidence for claims, and we, use scientific methodology and critical thinking skills to examine the evidence that's provided to support various claims. But, and here's a strong point I want to make, a good scientific skeptic is not a cynic. So one of the things that we hear a lot, I think, about skeptics is that's conflated with cynicism a lot. So it's, oh, if you're a skeptic, then you just don't believe anything, or you don't ever believe things that people tell you, or, you know, all these kinds of things that indicate like a complete close-mindedness, which could not be further from the truth for a good scientific skeptic, because a good scientific skeptic is actually open-minded about new ideas, right? So it's not that I am closed to things that I don't already believe in. It's just that I balance that openness and closeness. So in other words, when someone says something like, hey, you know, I ran over and killed a chupacabra on my way in today to class, that's why I was late. Like, I'm open to that possibility, right? Like, I'm open to that being the truth, but I'm not just going to blindly accept it just because someone says so, right? We're going to balance that. So again, you know, open-minded, but demanding evidence for claims at the same time. And so this is what I mean when I talk about what a scientific skeptic is, or, you know, when I just shorten it, I just call it a good skeptic, right? A skeptic. But that's not, it turns out, what everyone means when they say skeptic. So talking to you all, you know, you're a particular group, right? You're the students against pseudoscience. You're saying, hey, I'm fighting back against these outrageous claims or claims that don't have evidence potentially. So, you know, what kind of thoughts and, you know, other terms or adjectives are activated for you when I say skeptic? You know, what traits do you think that a skeptic might have that I've not already mentioned? Well, you might, because of the group of people that you are, might be thinking about, oh, okay, well, skepticism is very valuable. Like, you know, you can probably, if someone's a good skeptic, you might be able to trust the information they tell you more. Or, you know, maybe we view certain skeptics as being kind of wise or very thoughtful or, you know, loyal, curious, you know, forgiving, whatever those kind of adjectives happen to be. And these are all pleasant adjectives, right? My friends who are skeptics, you know, that are kind of in this community, a lot of us have these great qualities, and we all think about things in a hopefully, you know, fairly critically minded fashion, but we're still open. But it turns out that's not what a lot of people associate with skeptics and skepticism. And instead, what a lot of people associate that with is being arrogant, right? And I think we hear this a lot, where, you know, if we're making someone, for example, provide evidence to support their claims that their homeopathic medicine actually has effects beyond a placebo, or that vaccines are, you know, implanting 5G controlling microchips inside of us. And we say, I don't see any evidence for that. Like, you don't have anything to back that up. Okay, well, you're just being arrogant. You think you're a know-it-all, right? And what's interesting to me is that it's not just outside of the skeptic community that we see this kind of label being applied to skeptics. And in fact, we see it pretty frequently within the community. But let's make sure we all know what I mean when I say arrogant, though. Again, I like to make sure that we all have good operational definitions, right? So when I say arrogant, what do I mean? Well, I mean having an exaggerated sense of your own abilities, your own importance. You know, we think about people being very kind of proud or conceited, you know, feeling that they are somehow superior to other people. That's usually what we mean when we talk about arrogance. And that certainly could be used to describe a number of people who are in the skeptic community. It could also be used to describe a number of people who are not in the skeptic community, of course, right? And we'll kind of circle back to that a little bit later, but this is what I mean when I say arrogant. And again, this is often applied to us as skeptics and as scientists, And it's applied to us not just from without, so people who are not part of this community, but from within as well. So this idea of what we might call skeptical arrogance is really, really present for a large number of people in the kind of skeptic, atheist, scientific, humanist realm. And here are just some examples that if I do a quick Google search for skeptics and arrogant or arrogance, I see a lot of, for example, blog posts talking about this. People actively saying, hey, I don't call myself a skeptic. Like, I don't like that word. Most people who belong to societies that are considering themselves skeptical are, quote, loud, arrogant, angry, and cynical. And, you know, a lot of people saying, well, skeptics are in and of themselves dogmatic, right? They're cynics. They're not that they're open-minded at all. They're very closed. And you know, when I read these kinds of blogs about people or by people who call themselves skeptics, they have this kind of haughty tone, right, where they're know-it-alls and they're saying, oh, we are so far superior to you non-skeptics out there. So what's going on here, right? Because we have people both within and without the community who are saying, hey, what a bunch of arrogant pricks, right? Like, what's going on here for these skeptics? Not everyone, right? But apparently it happens often enough that it's become a meme, right? It's a mimetic idea about people who call themselves skeptics out there, that at least a significant percentage of them are arrogant in some way. So what I would submit is that there are some skeptics certainly who fit that category. But it turns out that there are multiple kinds of skeptics out there. And the multiple kinds of skeptics, and I'm going to divide them into two broad camps, are often just lumped into a single category, both from people outside of that area and sometimes people within that area. So the first kind of skeptic I want to draw attention to is what we call a pathological skeptic. And what pathological skeptics do, as illustrated by our picture here, is they're very close-minded, right? They're not interested in hearing in any way, shape, or form about new ideas or things that go against what they already hold as a belief. And so in this way, they really are very highly cynical, right? They're really marked by that cynicism of, I do know it all. Like, we already have this figured out. We don't need to, you know, keep an open mind at all. We don't need to hear alternative viewpoints or consider them. No, I'm going to just stop there. Like, I'm good. Like, I know everything that I need to know. And this is arrogance, right? Like, these kinds of pathological skeptics really are arrogant because they're saying, I know it. Like, there's no one that can prove me wrong, or there's nothing that could prove me wrong about a particular belief. And they're not even willing to kind of entertain those ideas. But that's not what I'm talking about, right? What I'm talking about are scientific skeptics. And scientific skeptics, like we talked about earlier, are open to new ideas. They're very willing, it turns out, to change their beliefs if they're presented with good evidence. And I think this is one of those key aspects of being a scientist and a good skeptic, is that I do change my beliefs, right? I do change my practices if I'm a clinician. I do change the way that I operate if there's new evidence that shows, like, the way I'm operating, my beliefs don't have good backing, or now here's better data that shows I was wrong before. And so what this really means is that good skeptics, good scientific skeptics, are the opposite of arrogant. And that instead, they're actually displaying a lot of humility. So a good skeptic, I would argue, is actually very humble rather than very arrogant. But just like the word skeptic can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, the word humble or humility can mean very different things. So let's define what I mean by being humble versus what could happen or could be, interpreted as that. So when someone hears the word humility or humbleness, a lot of times this is kind of what they have in mind, right? Which is a low view or a modest view of your own importance. Somebody who's submissive or diffident, someone who, again, is displaying humbleness. But that's not the kind of humility that I mean. Oftentimes, people also conflate being humble, particularly in the Western hemisphere, with being religious. And if we look up, humble or humility, for example, in the various translations of the Bible, we find things like humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. And we see that a lot in terms of messages where you're supposed to be humble before God, or humble in the knowledge that you don't know what the plan is, and things like that. And that's not the kind of humility that I mean either. So I don't mean being hyper modest or having a low opinion of yourself, or kneeling before some sort of external force or God. So if that's not what I mean, well, what do I mean? So I mean more of the kind of humility that we talk about in science. For example, what Richard Feynman talked about when he said, I can live with doubt and uncertainty. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. Now, that's a very different kind of humility. Right? That's the kind of humility that makes me say, hey, I don't know. Or, well, here's what we think we know right now, but we could be wrong. And that's okay. So when I talk about humility, I'm talking about this kind of what we would call intellectual humility or scientific humility, where I'm okay with not knowing things 100%. And we see this in a lot of our early writings on skepticism and on kind of the development of scientific skepticism. For example, Isaac Asimov, who was, the famous science fiction writer, but also wrote a lot on science in general. He one time had this, which was, inspect every piece of pseudoscience and you will find a security blanket, a thumb to suck, a skirt to hold. What does the scientist have to offer in exchange? Uncertainty, insecurity. And it's true, right? Like, think about the pseudoscientific practitioners, or those folks who have incredible levels of belief in things that maybe don't have as much evidence as you think they should. Are they being humble in regards to that? If I go down the street and go to one of my local psychics or chiropractors or energy healers or whoever, are they operating with levels of uncertainty? Are they feeling like, hey, I'm not sure that I know these things? I would argue they're probably not. And that in fact, they're showing the exact opposite of what we as good skeptics actually show, which is humility. So that's why I posit, and I really try and encourage people to embrace this idea of humility of a specific kind, like I've been talking about, as really a skeptical virtue. Because good skeptics, good scientists, really could be describing themselves as what I would call a humble skeptic, which is someone who accepts that life is uncertain. And I'm okay with things being ambiguous and not knowing things 100%. And that's fine with me. I'm okay with that. Now, that's very different from the attitude that we see in most pseudoscientific practitioners or in very large numbers of religious believers who do not embrace uncertainty, right? Who do not accept ambiguity and instead claim 100% to know that something is true, which is, again, the opposite of humility. That's arrogance. Because a good, humble skeptic recognizes the limits of their own knowledge. Like me, for example, I have a doctorate in clinical psychology. I've been studying psychology since 1998, and I know more than most anybody on the planet about psychology. But that doesn't mean I know everything about it. That doesn't mean that I know everything there is to know about everything just because I have a degree in psychology. Like, I recognize that my friend who's a microbiologist knows infinitely more than I do about the realm of biology. My friends who are physicians know infinitely more about anatomy and physiology than I do. I recognize, like, here's my domain of knowledge. And because I recognize that I have a limited domain of knowledge, that means that I, as a humble skeptic, am also okay with saying, well, I don't know. When someone asks me questions in class, for example, and I don't know the answer, it doesn't bother me one bit to say, you know what? I'm not sure. I don't know that. But here's how we can maybe find out together what the answer to that is, or even if we have a decent answer for that. And I know, especially with you all, being in university and having gone through school in various ways, we've all encountered those professors or teachers who aren't okay with saying that, right? Who would rather pretend to know something than admit that they don't know everything. And that's the opposite of humility. That's arrogance. So along with all these things, then the humble skeptic is willing to change their beliefs based on new, good quality evidence. That's not someone being arrogant, right? Think about, if you have, the people that you've interacted with who hold pseudoscientific beliefs, non-scientific beliefs, and think about, what would it take for them to change their beliefs? A few years ago, we held a conference here on our campus where I brought together a panel of skeptics and non-skeptics. And the non-skeptic side of the panel included a gentleman who was a very staunch believer in Bigfoot or the Sasquatch, right? These kind of giant man-apes that are roaming North America, supposedly. And when he was directly asked, what would it take for you to change your belief that Bigfoot is real? What he said was that if he could see every animal at once in North America at the same time and not be able to see a Bigfoot, that's what would change his mind. Which is, of course, insane, right? That's these kind of omnipotent, godlike powers. So he's saying basically nothing's willing to change my mind, right? I'm not going to change my mind. For me, if I was asked that question, I would say a specimen, a live or dead specimen, that would change my mind like that. Because I recognize the limits of my knowledge. I'm okay with changing my beliefs, but I'm okay with changing them when the evidence is good. Now, the opposite of this non-humble skeptic, right? This pathological skeptic, what they do is they tend to live in these echo chambers, right? Where instead of seeking out information that could potentially disconfirm their belief, they're only seeking out that information that further solidifies their belief. So they're talking to people, reading things that only reinforce them. So they would be very guilty of what we would call the disconfirmation bias. So I'm not doing any sort of attempt at disconfirming my beliefs or seeking information that doesn't fit with what I already believe. And even if I'm presented with that information, I'm not going to change. Even if there's better information that's let's say, more new, or that it's, very clearly conclusively proved that, the human bioenergetic field is not able to be, sensed by these practitioners of energy medicine, they're still not going to change. They're going to further entrench. And that means these non-humble skeptics are what we talked about earlier, which is this kind of pathological skepticism. And this is a skepticism of a kind that we don't just see in the skeptical community. I think we can see it in the skeptical community, but we're more likely to actually see this outside of the skeptical community, which is that arrogance that, well, I have this special knowledge, or I have these special powers that put me above you. So therefore, I know more than you do, and I'm not willing to listen to those people who have other things to say. So a humble skeptic is really displaying this, what I call this core value of intellectual humility, which is really this balancing act. It's the middle ground between being completely gullible and completely cynical, right? Where I'll believe anything you say, I'll believe nothing you say. An intellectually humble skeptic says, yeah, we've got to keep an open mind, but not so open that our brain falls out. I've got to be aware of my own limitations and biases, which are very easy to spot in other people, but we often miss those in ourselves. And we have this ability to appreciate alternative ideas and alternative explanations for evidence, for data. And we can hold those in mind. We can hold, two different ideas or explanations in mind and weigh out the merits of those. And so we're really saying that, hey, I, as an intellectually humble skeptic, like, I know what I know, but I know what I don't know. And that's not saying that I'm kind of dismissing my own expertise or that I'm dismissing the knowledge I do have, but it's that, hey, here's what I know with decent certainty, right? Here's what I don't know, and I'm okay with that. And when we apply that in the real world, in our daily lives, in our intellectual lives, in our academic lives, this can really be seen as a type of arrogance control. Because I'm saying, I don't know everything. I'm willing to change. But I'm not just going to have this open mind that you can just feed with whatever you want. So this being humble in this particular way, intellectual humility, is, I think, a crucial virtue for a good scientific skeptic, for a good critical thinker, for an honest scientist. And so the true value of skepticism for me is that it leads us to be comfortable with uncertainty. It leads us to be comfortable with ambiguity, and it leads us to be open to new ideas while still maintaining our core values of empiricism and an evidence basis for our beliefs. So, Carl Sagan once wrote about this and was talking about kind of the price science demands. And that those of us who really do follow this kind of scientific methodology and critical thinking then is that, science demands a terrible price, that we accept what experiments tell us about the universe, whether we like it or not. And it requires that we utter frequently those hateful words, I might be wrong. And to me, that's really at the core of what being a good scientific skeptic is. And for me, being a scientific skeptic keeps me intellectually humble and lets me know that I'm not arrogant, right? And I don't display arrogance, I display curiosity. But I still make demands of people presenting claims to me. So that's kind of what I had for my talk. I thought I would just kind of leave it open for any questions that had come in now or discussion anybody wanted to have. and just kind of turn it back over then to Barty and Chris and anyone else.
So firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much for the talk. It was great. I also want to say Shreyas is here. So you can say hi to Shreyas, who you've probably been receiving all the emails from. And the next thing is that to the audience, you're very welcome to send in questions. We'll start things off, but if you send in anything you want to ask to Caleb, I'm sure that he'd be very, very happy to answer. So the first thing that I wanted to ask was, he talked about these different categories of skeptic, and obviously those definitions, you know, I imagine an individual can move between those categories. How do you recommend, or do you have any thoughts on how, as an organization or group of people, you stop yourself creating an echo chamber where you just have like-minded individuals and you move away from, even if you all start as humble skeptics, you move towards this pathological state where you're just self-reinforcing your own beliefs?
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to all recognize what you talked about, which is that I may be in this kind of humble skeptic realm in one area, but I might not be in another, right? Like I might be very cynical about a particular area and not a different area. So certainly we can all display these traits as opposed to like, oh no, you're the humble skeptic, you're the cynical skeptic. Like, no, we can definitely move between those categories. I think that's a really great point, Barty. As far as avoiding echo chambers, I think we have a lot of research right now that shows us that when you get people together who all believe the same thing, then they just tend to get more extreme in that belief, whatever it is. So, you know, one thing that I always encourage is, how do I maintain contact with those other groups or those other belief systems? So for me personally, that means seeking out and reading information that I probably wouldn't naturally encounter and that I probably don't agree with, whether that's different political ideas or whether that's from people who have different ideas than I do about what the most effective treatments for various kinds of psychopathology are, or people who, you know, are believers in various kinds of pseudoscience. So one thing I try to do pretty regularly is actually read what are people saying about, you know, in my field, these pseudoscientific therapies and things that I would say don't have evidence for them. Okay, like, what are they saying? What claims are they making? What are they basing their beliefs off of? Because for me, knowing why someone believes what they do does a couple of things. One, it helps us empathize with that group and make them into less of an other, right? Where we then can start to demonize them and, you know, think that, you know, there's some sort of terrible people, when in reality, they're just people with different belief systems. And then two, the second thing that does is, one, it helps me understand them better and empathize with them. But then it also helps me understand the arguments that they're going to make so that I can then say, hey, okay, well, are those good arguments? Like, are those decent arguments, or do I have good counters to those arguments? So that allows me to practice this critical thinking that I think is so important, right? So, you know, I think those are the two main ways that I would avoid kind of being in that echo chamber. You know, seeking out information that doesn't fit with your worldview, and honestly talking to people who have those kinds of worldviews really helps you avoid that, even if the whole time you're like, I don't think they're not saying anything that's true or accurate. Like, well, but you can still have that conversation, I think.
Right. Thank you. I think Shreyas has a question, and then we've got a couple of questions that have been sent in that I will read out. That's okay.
Hi, Caleb. Yeah, thanks for coming. Sorry I couldn't be there. I'm kind of tuning in from the lab. I caught the second half of your talk, so I had a question based on that. So the intellectual humility which you talked about, isn't that the same kind of things that pseudoscientific practitioners like to prey on when they attack scientists, when they attack our kind of skeptic philosophy?
So yes, in part. And we see this, I think, not just with necessarily pseudoscientists, but with general attacks on science, which is this idea of like, oh, well, you're always changing and you're always shifting. Oh, you said butter was bad for us, and now you're saying vegetable oil is bad for us, and things like that, which is, for, I would say, them, they think that that's an amazing argument. But it's not for us, right? Because why? Well, we know that what we're doing is we're getting better, right? Like we're getting closer to quote unquote truth, right? The evidence is getting better. Like, well, we used to believe that, you're right. But then we have this better evidence that shows why that's wrong. And for a lot of people, I know here in the US, like science is taught almost as like this collection of facts, as opposed to a methodology that helps us get closer and closer to the truth. And so a lot of people, pseudoscientific practitioners, definitely play on that aspect and then prey upon our natural pushback against ambiguity and uncertainty. Like we as humans don't naturally like to be uncertain, right? Like we like certainty. And that's why I think this idea of intellectual humility is so important for us, because what it does is it shows that, hey, I can be reasonably certain about these things, but that doesn't mean that I'm unreasonably certain. So that's that balance again, I think, that we have to have as good scientific skeptics, critical thinkers, because that's not a balance that a lot of people have, right? They would rather trade certainty for, actually knowing what's going on. And we see that, of course, in lots of different areas, pseudoscience and politics and religion. But I think it's a valid point, Shreyas, where, yeah, that's something people prey on and exploit, I would say. But not necessarily actually a weakness from us.
Yeah, and like I agree with your point that for us as scientists, as skeptics, we know that we are getting closer to some sort of truth, perhaps, when we keep changing our views on some things. But as you correctly pointed out as well, that they don't think that, right? They think that certainty is truth, which isn't really. So how do we convince them is kind of my question. I mean, I don't want to make it a we and them thing, but how do we convince people?
So I actually think it starts long before you have to do the convincing. So I think a lot of our educational systems actually need more of an emphasis on methods over results. So how do we get to what we think we know right now? Because once we start thinking about that and engaging in a lot more what I would call metacognition, right? So thinking about our thoughts, thinking about our beliefs. One of the most effective ways we can do that with interpersonal conversations is helping people kind of break down why it is they believe what they believe in, right? So if you come tell me that, oh, hey, I'm a Scorpio and here's what that means and here's why that's important to me, I'm gonna say, okay, well, why do you think that's true? Like, what evidence do you have to support that? In a polite way, of course, not an arrogant way, but helping people actually understand how do they examine their own beliefs and where they come from is, I think, that first step in moving people towards a more epistemologically sound set of beliefs, which would develop well along with that kind of intellectual humility of, oh, maybe I don't know everything that I thought I did.
Yeah, thanks.
And we have a question from Neil. I'm just going to read out. Or Neil can ask it himself if he looks like he's just unmuted. Would you like to go ahead, Neil?
Yeah, thanks. Oh, well, hello, Clay. Very much enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. Much of what you described there as the healthy skeptic, I've always thought of as just a good scientist as opposed to a skeptical scientist. So I'm a scientist. I like to think that I'm open-minded, that I'm always presenting the evidence for what I claim and believe and present to people. I prepare to change my mind. All of the things you described there, and I completely support that notion. But have I some kind of nuance here. There's a difference between what I would have called just simply being a good scientist, like I like to think of myself, or the kind of person you're describing. Or to put that another way, I suppose, can you be a good scientist and not be a skeptical scientist as you describe them?
Yeah, great question. Great question. I don't think one can be a good scientist without being a good skeptic and without being intellectually humble. I think that overlap is basically 100%. Now, we can have a lot of good skeptics who are maybe not actively involved in the making of science, right? So people who are not really doing research, but they're still engaging in scientific methodology in their daily lives, right? So even though I'm not running a grant-funded study, when I go to the grocery store and I'm seeing these claims about, various health aspects of organic food versus non-GMO versus frankenfoods or, whatever, I'm still using that same kind of scientific methodology and mindset to determine, okay, well, what's the validity of these claims? So, and that's why I call it, a good scientific skeptic, as opposed to, just being a pathological skeptic or a cynic. Because there is, I think, 100% overlap there. And if you're doing good science, you're being a good, I would say, intellectually humble skeptic. But you can be a scientific skeptic without actually doing or producing science as well, even though you're using that same kind of mindset.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
And we've just got another hands up, so I'll let you unmute and ask a question if you like.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Caleb. That was a really good talk. I'm really interested personally from my own research, which is to do with children and adolescents and how we can sort of almost kind of induce a mindset of critical thinking. And what I found is that it's sort of, what I'm curious to know from you is like, what kind of mechanism do you think like cognitively is going on in the mind of someone who is intellectually, because it can start from quite a young age where someone is just naturally quite exhibits those traits of being intellectually humble and engaging in like cognitive reflection and critical thinking. And then what I found on the other side is sort of more group-based, loyalty-based views that are more to do with like perpetuating and propagating the group's position regardless of its truth. So what I'm trying to underpin is the mechanism. So what do you think, from your understanding, is the sort of cognitive mechanism at play for both sides? So someone who is refusing to perhaps be in a situation, you were talking about like uncertainty and how much, avoiding uncertainty, it's a very human thing that we don't, avoiding uncertainty is so important to us, and we'll do a lot of things to avoid uncertainty. But for children where the whole world is a big question mark and you're just sort of growing and you're learning about the world, how would you suggest we sort of create those sort of educational tools and the classroom norms that sort of highlight the sort of cognitive mechanism that might be at play and like encourage a sort of way of thinking that, I guess, something like what I found is like with social media, it forces you to do the opposite because it rewards you for being like spontaneous and quick and witty and funny. Not necessarily, nobody really likes the person who's going to be like, hold on, that might not be true, but they prefer someone to kind of come up with random claims and then they'll probably not fact check it. That was a very long question, but basically just as in terms of like, because I know you have some interest in like child and adolescence as well. So like from that point of view, what do you recommend for like classroom interventions or just cognitive mechanisms?
Yeah, so we actually, from the UK, have this really cool program called P4C, which is Philosophy for Children. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it's a really outstanding curriculum for very, very young, so primary through kind of high school or secondary schools. that can integrate these kinds of things into everyday curricula. Because, you know, and I'm not nearly as familiar with obviously the UK system of education, but I have friends who are teachers there. There's a lot of this emphasis on like, well, you learn this, you learn this, you learn this, rather than emphasis on here's how we know this, right?
Yeah.
Here's how we know this. How can you find this, right? How can you get this information? And that's what like that P4C curriculum helps do, which is really one of the big things that we do when we do, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy. When I work with children and adolescents, what I do is I'm teaching them really to be better critical thinkers about their own thoughts, about their own emotions, about their own behaviors, and kind of instilling that principle of, you know, just because you feel it, just because you have a thought, that doesn't mean that it's true, right? Like that doesn't mean that it's accurate. How would we find that out, right? How would we test that out? How would we know if that is an accurate thought, right? And this is, I think, just as crucial for folks who are more, you could sort of normally developing, as well as those folks who struggle with things like anxiety or depression or obsessive-compulsive disorder, is again, stopping and reflecting on your own behavior, your own beliefs, and saying, okay, well, but why, right? Like, why did I do that? Why do I think this way? Why do I believe this way? As opposed to having this idea of, well, I do, so therefore it must be correct. So yeah, so I'd encourage you to look at that P4C curriculum, the philosophy for children. It's really, really cool and integrates a lot of that kind of dealing with and tolerating uncertainty and viewing uncertainty and ambiguity not as something that's terrible and bad, but as a natural part of life and something that we just learn how to tolerate and be okay with, instead of saying, no, we can't, like, we can't have it. That's terrible.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so
Sure.
much.
Does anyone else have any questions? Chris? No? Cool. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your talk. It was extremely interesting. I speak for, I hope, everyone, definitely myself, when I say I learned a lot. Oh, no, sorry. Oh, it's just thank you. So thank you very much for coming. It was lovely having you. We'd love to have you back at some point.
Yeah, I appreciate you all kind of hosting me and giving this opportunity. Maybe next time we can make it in person or something.
Absolutely.
Yeah,